three. Policy committee meeting to order. Item 2 on the approval of the agenda, we are going to, as I sent out an email to you earlier this afternoon. We are going to table items 6 through 8. We will discuss those later on in the meeting during the water trail update, but we're going to take those off as action items for tonight. So I would ask for approval of the agenda as amended to move to further amended to delete list. Second, Motion County, second by Holm. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Fine. Abstentions. That motion carries. All right, item 3 is approval of the minutes from March meeting. Move. Second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions. Motion carries. By the way, I will have to be leaving earlier, so at some point here, I'm going to turn this over to the vice chair to carry on for the remainder of the meeting, just so you go ahead as well. It's not because I'm getting mad, but I do have to leave for another. Item 4, consent and vote on the approval of the financial statement. Ted, you want to comment that, please?
Yeah, the finance subcommittee met on Monday. We made a few tweaks here and there. Len provided a lot of great insight into some changes we can do with the financial reporting. We've gotten all the transactions and the vendor list that we're now receiving on a monthly basis. The water trails information has also been included. So it's a fuller statement, a fuller review that we're doing on a monthly basis at this point. And I think it's pretty much ready to go. If Rhonda or Dylan had anything else to add.
Okay. So are we only using Denman quarterly, not once a month?
Yeah, I mean, this is
Quarterly?
yeah. at
I
this
see you're
point.
shaking your head. Okay.
All right, any further questions? Motion?
Second.
Motion by Clark, second by Reba. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions, motion carries. Item 5, public comment time. Todd, do we have anybody that wants to comment?
I have not received anything.
So we move on from that. We deleted items 6 through 8, so we move on to item 9, the report and vote on the federal fiscal year 27 STE funding recommendation. Zach?
Thank you. The funding subcommittee has made their recommendation for federal fiscal year 2027 STBG funding. We have a little over $16 million available to award this year and a little over $39 million in requests. So it was every year is tough for the funding subcommittee. We always have a lot of good projects and not enough funding to fund them all. But this year, I think it was especially difficult for them. There were a lot of good projects. Just to go over those projects real quick, we had 2 projects that were submitted under the system capacity category that the committee recommended funding to. The City of Grimes Southeast 37th project. And Waukees also road replacement. You can see 400,000 for Grimes and 600,000 for Waukee. Most of the projects were in the major reconstruction and replacement category. On the next slide here. You can see there's a lot of them there. Altoona is recommended to receive 500,000 for their 8th Street project. It's 1.1 million for their first relight bond grant, 250,000 for Grant Street South realignment. 1.7 million for Des Moines Douglas Avenue corridor improvements, 2.6 million for Des Moines East Army Post Road improvements, 500,000 for Johnson's 141 Towner Drive interchange, 1.7 for Polk County's Northeast 23rd Avenue, 500,000 for Urbandale's Douglas Avenue or Douglas Parkway preservation, and then 1.5 million for West Des Moines Ashworth Road reconstruction. In the system optimization category, we had 3 projects that were recommended to receive funding. The City of Des Moines for their intelligent transportation system upgrade phase 7, $1 million. Pleasant Hills, we recommended to receive $500,000 for their University Avenue Boulevard improvements. And then Warren County for their G16 HMA resurfacing, they're recommending $200,000 for that project. We only had 1 bridge project submitted this year, and they're being recommended to receive $1.2 million for the University Avenue Bridge in Des Moines. Then I believe we got a couple of the transit, they submitted for a bus replacement, cycle station. 1.5 million is being recommended for that project, and then the MPO, as they usually do, gets the $95,000 to their TMA program. Next slide. This just kind of gives you an idea of where we kind of fall with our targets. If you'll recall, we kind of have a goal of where we want to hit with each one of those categories. As you can see, we're pretty much on track. We do not have as many projects submit under the system capacity category as we typically do. So that's a little bit lower than what we typically see, but we didn't have a lot of projects in that category. As I mentioned, most of the projects were submitted in the major reconstruction replacement, so you're seeing most of the funding going into that category. System optimization, we had 3 projects, but not really high dollar projects, so we're a little bit under that target, but again, not a lot of projects submitted, so it's kind of to be expected. The bridge program, again, typically we have maybe 2 to 3, maybe even 4 projects that will submit under here. We only had the 1 project this year, so that's why you're seeing that a little bit under that 20%. We typically get a little closer to the 20% on that one. And then transit was pretty much right on track. And again, those are just targets that we try to hit. There's no requirement that we do that. We're just trying to stay in line with our long-range plan. So that kind of gives you an idea of where those projects kind of shook out this year as far as the various different categories. I may have one more slide here. Oh, that's it. That's the funding subcommittee's recommendation. I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has on the recommendation.
I just have a really quick comment. I know we appreciate your work on it. Great job putting it together for our subcommittee. The only thing I think that, and this is on us, it's on Polk County and our staff, but from a bridge funding standpoint, you know, from Polk County's position, the Northeast 23rd reconstruction project was huge for us because it impacted multiple jurisdictions, Altoona, Pleasant Hill, Des Moines. So that was our focus. We thought if we focused specifically on that one project, because we have, I don't know, I think 2 or 3 small bridge projects in unincorporated Polk County that we probably would have submitted, but I said, now let's focus on our priorities right here. But and so just so. I got to talk to our staff too about the fact that there's bridge projects that probably need to be part of this process more than trying to strategize on a big regional project like Moines 23rd. You have thoughts on that?
I mean, you know, the funding subcommittee is kind of free to allocate those funds where they want to, but I will say that since we implemented those categories and included that bridge category, they typically have been pretty consistent with giving money to those bridge projects. So if you submit in that category, you've got a really good shot, I think, at getting some funding for those bridges.
That's kind of what I thought. So yeah, appreciate it.
All right. Any further questions? Their motion.
Move approval, Hanson.
Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions, motion carries. Item 10 then is to discuss the federal fiscal year 22 excess funding.
So each year when the DOT sends us the targets for that year, so when they send us the targets for federal fiscal year 27, they also send us the final targets for past years. And we're able to compare those final targets to what we actually awarded out in funding for that year. Sometimes we award out more funding than actually ends up being available. And we've got a little bit of a negative, and then but for most of the time, we have a little bit more funding available to award out. A few years ago, the executive committee created a policy that if we ever have over $250,000 in excess funding, we award out that funding in a special excess funding award that's done kind of concurrently with the STBG process. So that's what we're talking about today. We looked at monies from federal fiscal year 2021, where we had a little bit of a negative balance. That's where the final target came back a little bit lower than what had originally been reported to us from the DOT. And then federal fiscal year 22, where we had a $2.1 million balance. So when we combined those two together, it was a little over $1.2 million we had available, which is obviously over the 250 in the policy. So we brought that before the funding subcommittee and had them award out or provide a recommendation for where to award those funds. And what that policy states is that the subcommittee will look at projects that are within the last 3 years of the current TIP. So we shared that list with them. The list was included in your agenda packet, so you can see all the projects that were eligible to receive this funding. Ultimately, the funding subcommittee decided to award these 3 projects on the screen additional funding. The city of Ankeny's West First Street widening, they recommended that it receive $500,000 additional dollars. Des Moines Douglas Avenue corridor, also $500,000, and Polk City's North Third Reconstruction Trail and Overlay, $271,651. So this is the excess funding award recommendation from the funding subcommittee, which is before you for your approval. If you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to take them.
Zach, any questions on this item? Motion?
I do have a question. How was the allocation of these funds determined? Was this determined by the funding subcommittee?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Move approval. Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All same sign. Abstentions. Motion carries. Item 11 is report and vote on the comprehensive safety action plan request for proposals. Zach.
Staff has been working on developing the RFP for the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant funding that was received by the MPO. If you recall, we submitted an application for the MPO for $800,000. We also submitted an application on behalf of SERPA for $200,000. When we were working with the US DOT, they recommended to us that we combine those 2 into a single grant agreement, and that the MPO would be the one entity that would handle the grant administration. So based on that recommendation, we did that, and then we ended up being awarded $1 million in SF4A funding to create a safety action plan. And basically what the purpose of the safety action plan is to make us eligible for the implementation funding that goes along with this program. You know, up to $50 million is what is eligible, the MPO is eligible for at the end of this. So quite a bit of money on the table, and the committee felt very strongly that we should pursue this grant. So we have developed the RFP. I'll just really quickly kind of cover the basic content of the RFP, which is before you on the screen there. One of the major important tasks is the public engagement, stakeholder engagement. We envision this being a really important part of this process. One reason why we requested what we did in federal funding was because we knew that those kind of engagement processes cost a lot of money. We want to make sure that we didn't, we had the budget to do a public engagement process that we would all be happy with. Task 2 is to look at the state of practice within the region, and then data review, collect a lot of data. Same with task 3, look at all the crash data, analyze it, really identify and drill down to where those main areas are where we're seeing fatality and injury crashes. Task 4 would be to develop a countermeasure toolbox. This would really be kind of a list of things that communities can do to help address safety issues within their various different jurisdictions. Task 5, developing implementation plan and programs. This is kind of where the projects would be located within the plan. We're envisioning that we would identify 10 to 12 main corridors across the region that really need to be looked at from a safety perspective, but then also each individual community would be submitting their projects, their safety priorities within their community, so that those projects would be eligible for implementation dollars as well. Task 6 is to do a safe streets visualization and a Vision Zero toolkit. This is basically just giving more visualization to it, so a little easier for people to kind of see what some of these safety treatments look like on the roadways. And then task 7 would be to kind of combine everything into that safety action plan. And then the final task that we would be putting before the consultant team would be to develop an implementation grant to submit on behalf of the MPO. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the main content of the RFP is. I think on the next slide, we've got a rough schedule we're looking at. We're planning on, assuming that the RFP is approved today, we would issue that most likely sometime tomorrow. We're looking at a proposal deadline of May 12th. And then in mid-May, having a consultant selection group, which has yet to be put together. They would review the RFPs, and then we would schedule interviews probably for late May, early June. Depending on how many consultants apply for it, will really kind of determine how many consultants we might bring in for interview. I suspect we probably wouldn't interview any more than probably 3 consultants. At the most, but again, it kind of depends on how many different proposals we get back from consultants. We would bring whatever recommendation that committee had before the policy committee in June, and then hopefully award that contract shortly after there in late June. With the hope that we could get the plan going and have it completed for approval probably in August of 2024. And then be able to apply for implementation dollars in 2024 as well. Since we developed this timeline, we have found out that they decided to release the NOFO for Sage Streets and Roads for All implementation funds a lot earlier than we had expected. It's already out. We were anticipating it was going to be a fall release like the original round. That really puts us in a tough position potentially to apply for the implementation dollars in 24. So we are going to have some conversations with Federal Highway, kind of find out what they're thinking about as far as when they're going to release that NOFO next year. Maybe give them some feedback as far as how we'd really like to see it released a little bit later. I think we might also see if what their willingness is to allow us to, if they do release that NOFO early, to still submit for it next year, even though maybe our plan is not completely finalized. So we are going to explore those paths. Just wanted to make you aware that that has kind of thrown our original timeline off a little bit. However, even if they do release early and they don't let us apply, we will still have 2 more years after 2024 to apply for those implementation funds. I think that's all I have. But be happy to answer any questions that anybody has on the RFP.
All right, thank you, Zach. Any questions for Zach on this?
I'll move it.
Second. Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Abstentions? That motion carries. Thank you, Zach. Item 12 is the report and vote on the passenger transportation plan draft. Carl.
Thank you. So the DOT requires us to update the passenger transportation plan every 5 years. The MPO has worked with regional stakeholders in the area to make those changes. A reminder that this plan focuses on our populations that are most disadvantaged and identifying those barriers that to them. So we are looking for approval of final draft, which will then submit to the DOT on May 1st. Any questions? I'll take the questions.
Move approval. Second.
Okay, motion a second. Any further discussion, questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Any abstentions? Okay, it's approved. Item 13, report and vote, water trails build grant payment approval. Todd.
Thank you. Next slide. Have our next payment approval for the work the contractor's been doing out, on pay application number 4. It's for a little over $623,000. Of that, just a little under $59,000 is for reimbursable expenses that we can reimburse for right away. The remaining amount is for stored materials, mainly rock. We cannot submit other reimbursement for those costs until the materials are actually used in the project due to DOT rules. But we'll follow up with those when they are used. The funds for this will be put into the account by ICON to pay for this invoice. We would recommend approval for the payment. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Todd? Not, I have a motion.
Move approval.
Second. Okay, for a second, any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say same. Any abstentions? Okay. Item 14, report and vote. Approval authority for water trails build grant payments. Todd, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Last month we had the issue where, a few months of the year, the policy committee doesn't meet, and we had a payment application that needed to get paid on the water trails grant. So the idea was to figure out a way that we wouldn't have to call a special policy meeting on those months. So we built a policy that would allow the executive committee to approve those expenditures for water trails, pay applications in the months of March and July and December when the policy committee doesn't meet, just so we can keep that payment process moving along and not hold up any work or put the contractor behind on moving their money forward. So this policy again would only be effect for the water trails build grant process and would only really happen in March, July, and December of each year during the construction of the project. I'd be happy to answer any questions, would recommend approval.
Thank you. Any questions for Todd?
I'll move it.
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Let's say same. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Okay. Item 15, report Mid-Iowa Planning Alliance MIPA contract. Todd?
Thank you. First slide. So we've been having obviously a lot of discussion about this and needed to get some further direction as we move closer to finalizing our budget for the work program with the DOT on June 1st. Just as a reminder, we entered into a contract with MIPA back in April of last year to provide kind of three pieces of service for MIPA. We began all these discussions for MIPA back in January of 2020. So the three main areas that we provide support for the MIPA organization is general back office support, leasing some office space for the staff of MIPA, some supervisory support for the staff, and then on certain projects, helping with some planning support that is paid for by MIPA. The MIPA contract requires 60 days notice, written notice by either party to terminate. We did provide in the link with the agenda, the kind of the timeline of all the discussions and links to the agendas and the meetings in the packet of material. Next slide. Just kind of overview, the MPO has 10 staff focused on MPO activities. Each staff does have some hours of time on SRPTA and MIPA activities to support those contracts. About 8% on SRPTA, a little around 3% for MIPA activities. There are two MPOs, there are two MIPA staff members that are focused on MIPA activities. One that was directly hired by MIPA, that's Caleb Knutson, and one that was hired by the MPO, but was for contracted housing assistant and is paid for through those contracts. No MPO dollars or staff or assessment dollars go towards paying for that staff person. Next slide, please. So some of the things to consider, budget impacts for the contract that MIPA, as I mentioned, pays the MPO for personnel cost, salary, and fringe for the MPO staff hours that are used on those activities, similar to what's for SRPTA. A portion of the MPO's office overhead indirect costs are paid through that contract. And then there is an administrative fee of 5% that on MPO personnel that are charged to that contract. If you completely separate MIPA from the MPO, it does have about a $93,000 hit to the budget. With MIPA, we have a positive balance. Without MIPA, a negative balance. Next slide. So some of the things we've been asked, the executive committee asked us to look into over this past week, or how we could help maybe transition these things. So that general office support of office space, kind of the back room stuff of accounting and budgeting, payroll, those type of things. We reached out to a number of organizations, contacted ISU Extension. They were a no. DMAC had some questions. Grandview has some interest. Community Foundation had some questions. We haven't heard back from Story County about having that, the office space administrative support. Done some investigation on benefits and back office support and transitioning away from MPO and what those costs would be. And then we talked with some of the officers of MIPA, the executive members of their board. This general office support is the most important part of the existing contract to them for at least right now. Ideally, they'd like to see that remain in place. There's, we entered a 3-year contract, or MIPA entered a 3-year contract with EDA that showed the MPO providing support to the MIPA for those 3 years. They'd love to see that continue, but we could, at the minimum, they'd like to see at least another year as they put together their transition plan. And not end it at the end of the fiscal year. They just think that's too soon. Next slide. The other area, one of the other areas, planning support from MPO planners doing, various activities for MIPA on different projects. This has a moderate importance to them. It's very helpful to them, but they would like it to continue another year, but not as important as the office and backroom support. Next slide. And then the supervisory support, we talked with them about this, and this is, well, they said it was a nice to have. They could begin taking that over at the start of fiscal 24. So that would be a piece we could transition relatively quickly. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so happy to answer any questions.
I just got maybe a question, or probably for Scott, but as some of you probably know, I know Todd knows, Polk County took formal action to not renew with MIPA on July 1 of this year. We don't see any positive things as far as a lot of duplication, a lot of redundancy on things that we already do and things that we already paid for. I realize there may be some positive things for small communities that want to utilize staff from either MIPA or the MPO to manage grant applications and what have you. My question, I guess, more formally is, once Polk County is formally out of it, which we already paid our fee for this year, will an executive committee member and a policy committee member, will I still vote, Scott, on those issues when these MIPA issues come up after that as agenda items? Because we won't be members come July 1.
That's a great question. I'd never thought about it. I don't think that you would have a vote on those issues because you're representing an entity.
That's what I assume too. It's not really important. Just think about it. Let me know what your thoughts are, whatever. So I know what to do in the future after July 1.
So Todd, if we put in this transition plan of 1 year for back office, 1 year for the staff support, but then eliminate the supervisory support at the end of the fiscal year, how does that change the financial numbers for the budget?
The supervisory support is very minimal part of that, so it wouldn't change the numbers a whole lot. It's mostly the overhead and fringe rates through the office space and the accounting that really is the bulk of that. The contracted work is a piece of it as well, but by eliminating the supervisory piece, it wouldn't impact the MPO budget significantly.
So for this upcoming fiscal year, our budget doesn't really adjust much, but then we can plan for the following fiscal year if we were to do that. Is that accurate?
Correct.
So Scott, a legal question for you, MIPA. As we're not board members of MIPA, but it's still under the MPO organization, if one of these contracts, something would go wrong with it, that MIPA is in charge. Since it's under the umbrella of the MPO and all of us sit on this board, the MPO is going to be liable for any type of lawsuit, correct?
I don't think so. I mean, MIPA is a separate entity. I mean, MIPA, contracts with the MPO for certain services. So I think if there's something went wrong, it would be MIPA's responsibility, not the MPO's.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify that as well. My understanding is that MIPA is its own entity, and it is simply sharing resources with the MPO to complete the work that they need to do. As far as any actions taken or decisions made, that is wholly separate and isolated to MIPA. MPO is not involved in any decisions made. Is that correct?
Correct. It is a separate entity, has its own board that approves actions and approves its budget.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that the only involvement that MPO has with MIPA is simply the sharing of resources?
That's, yeah, I mean, the office space, supervising the staff, we have that under the contract, and then the contracting any of the employees to do any work. If that happens, yes, that's sharing of those resources.
Thank you.
But Todd and staff work for this board. And they have to answer to us. So if something would go wrong, he is the supervisor of the MIPA staff. It seems to me like there's some kind of conflict there. I don't know, that worries me a little bit, Scott.
Council, I'm happy to look at the contract, but I think, we have a separation because there's contractual agreement between MIPA and MPO. So any services that the MPO currently provides to MIPA are pursuant to a contract. And so, presumably, if MPO would be grossly negligent in its performance of those duties, then it may be, may incur some contractual liability. But, I think the contractual liability would be on behalf of MIPA instead.
Todd, are we obligated to rent office space for the MIPA employees, or can we continue to provide them space within our existing space since we have a teleworking policy? Or does that impact our bottom dollar?
I mean, by providing the office space they are paying part of the office rent and overhead on that. The contract doesn't specify office space.
Okay, so we can find a conference room or something within our existing footprint.
Correct.
2 employees, I'm gonna take up much space.
For the transition for this, is this something we anticipate might be kind of facilitated over several months, or is it gonna be in-house, kind of a work through it? How are we gonna handle what you describe as the transition?
It can happen, and it's really up to the board on how fast that happens, but the MIPA board that we met with earlier, the executive team would like to see at least a year timeframe to give them enough time to put their transition plan together and implement.
But Todd, my understanding, when I talked to Caleb, you review Caleb, right? You give him whatever compensation raise or whatever. That's your responsibility as the MPO director. That's what he told me, at least. Maybe I was mistaken.
No, the MIPA board under our contract asked for me to supervise Caleb. So I would do that in conjunction with the executive committee of the MIPA board. I would do the review, work with them to do the compensation.
And is that part of the supervisory support or the employee support, the other portion?
Supervisory support, yeah. So that would transition over to, under this scenario, back to MIPA at the beginning of the fiscal year.
I would just comment that I don't really see any reason to transition in 2 months, something that we just signed last year. It feels like pulling the rug out of a related entity. And I think a year, if they're asking for a year to try to figure out how to you know, get office space and benefits for employees is not an unreasonable request.
I would like to comment as well. Thank you, Courtney. That you know, I think that there's a value that MIPA provides. I think that there is also value in coordinating or sharing of resources between the two entities, because I think both operations benefit from that. The MPO benefits through the receipt of $93,000 per year because of the relationship, and MIPA benefits because they don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, I understand that there are some communities out there that don't find the value in MIPA, and they're making the decisions that they see fit to sever ties with them. However, I think from a different perspective, from a smaller community perspective, I think there is some value in MIPA and the relationship between the two entities. I personally don't see any downside to continuing with the existing structure as it sits. If there are changes that are requested by MIPA going forward in reducing the amount of shared resources, then I'm okay with that. But I don't see any strategic advantage to forcing this issue.
Okay, standpoint, there's a couple things going on here that listen into the discussion. And you've got the issue of, is it prudent to have the MPO utilizing member government funds for another organization such as MIPA at any level, whether it's in kind or for specific resources? That's one issue. And I understand that issue. I think it's a healthy debate. The other issue from our standpoint, it provides no service to us. That from a Polk County standpoint, we are the regional government. We do all, and I get it, like Carlisle and other organizations that need that support level with that, you know, applications for grants, administrative help and things like that. But currently we don't utilize those things in county government. We do that internally. So it just doesn't make any sense for us to continue to pay dues to an organization that we will never utilize for anything. So that's the two issues.
But this isn't really a discussion about whether member organizations continue to pay dues to MIPA. I mean, that's a whole separate situation. This is a discussion about whether or not MPO continues to provide services that are contractually paid for. I mean, it's not about like whether Waukee is going to continue to be a part of MIPA or Polk County or anything. It's MPO. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, nice. We had obviously our special meeting back in January. There was a lot of discussion on MIPA and the 28E agreement. And again, the MPO was primarily a transportation related organization. We manage a lot of transportation projects. Great work. Staff does an excellent job. But we got off into housing contracts and things, even for folks that are not even within our region. And I think that is, for me, is the divide on housing trust funds and those kinds of programs, which is under MIPA's umbrella, really need to be managed by them. And whatever we can do to start that separation, to get them to stand on their own feet, do their own thing under their own board, quite frankly, without the MPO's involvement, is where I personally would like to see this move. And if it's going to take them 6 months to a year, I would just like to see that timeline laid out very clearly. Because I've heard Ted say many times, and I agree with him, we don't want to just pull the rug out from under them and have it collapse because we've just walked away. I don't think that's to anybody's advantage. It doesn't set a very good tone for other things we may want to do in the future. So
Regarding the housing trust funds, those contracts have been terminated between the MPO and Central Ohio Housing Trust Fund and Story County Housing Trust Fund, and MIPA has picked those contracts up. So that transition has already happened.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Just to make sure I understood your first point, about MPO resources. Is it a net benefit to the MPO because of the fees received?
Because of what? I'm sorry.
Because of the fees. I think what they showed in the slide was that there's a net benefit to the MPO.
That's a huge, I appreciate your question because it's really important. to the philosophical discussion that I think that we've tried to have over the last 10 years, going clear back to strategic planning about the direction of the organization. And is the organization going to be based on how much work we can get outside that pays fees to the organization and offsets our costs? In other words, are we an organization that is here to make money? Or are we a transportation planning organization that functions solely on transportation planning and transportation infrastructure? That's really the base of the whole discussion that we have going on, but I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
But to
I would
answer your
agree.
question, yes, it's a net benefit,
Yeah, both of the things can be.
can be the
true,
same.
But I just want to make sure I understand.
And I do think there's some efficiencies of scale for utilization of the resources with the MPO, because I emphasize again, even as a small community, we are paying for services. So there's some efficiencies, I think, that can be had by maintaining, whether it's a very strict line and it's very contractual or supervisory. I do think there's a benefit to some, there's some efficiency of scale to, because we have good people on both sides of this, there's some efficiency to utilizing those resources.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would probably speak specifically to Tom's comments there, that I think that the focus that I have is that these are two distinct and wholly separate organizations. I don't think that there is an intermixing of spending MPO's money or vice versa. It is rent of the office space and some coordination of some common resources and things of that nature. Yes, there is a supervisory component, and perhaps maybe that is under the spirit of where this relationship goes too far. And I think that piece could simply be could be resolved. But I think that the value that the MPO derives here is they're basically subleasing space. And they're obtaining some money for that, which is bringing some income in the door. I don't perceive this myself as a situation where the MPO is expending resources to manage a different organization's workload. Perhaps I'm viewing this a little differently than others, but I'm focused on these are two separate and wholly different organizations, and they're just simply working side by side as a means of economies of scale, to Ruth's point.
To your comments, I would agree, Mayor, with what you said, to an extent. The only thing I'd say, and like I tried to share with the council earlier from Milwaukee, is that, it doesn't matter to us from Polk County standpoint, whether or not they become a completely separate entity with absolutely no strings tied to that organization at all, no funding, no administrative help, no supervisory help. We don't see value in being part of the organization. So as of July 1, we will no longer be part of it. And then we will not have, that's why I asked the question earlier. Frankly, the sooner I'm out of this debate, the better off Polk County is. Then I don't have to vote, and then I cannot show up for those items.
Okay,
So, just real quick, this kind of all started with the housing trust fund. And so we're here as taxpayers, pay the assessments and pay for this organization, pay for this building. It comes from either federal dollars with grants, things like that. So now what we're going to do is, and we're going to pay assessments with tax dollars. So now what we're going to do is we're going to compete with the private sector that are giving us the tax dollars. To me, we got to do one thing or another. We got to provide services for our residents, or we got to go and compete against the people that are paying the bills. And I think Tom touched on that originally, and I'm not comfortable doing that. That's how this all started. I had a consultant call me. Why are you guys doing the Story County Housing Trust? Why are you doing that? We would have bid on that, but we knew that you were going to be cheaper. That's a brick and mortar place paying taxes, paying for us to all sit in this room. For the tables, for the chairs, for everything, for Todd's salary, for everybody sitting over there. And we're gonna go compete with them. That you got to draw the line somewhere. And so, yes, we probably can provide a cheaper service. But really, can we? Are we? Because we're double dipping, Ruth. And you and I have had this conversation, and I'm not gonna get into it. That's just my statement, and I'll end it at that. I'm not comfortable with MIPA, and you know, we'll just have to move on from it, and we'll see how things
I
go.
understand your discomfort, and if Des Moines has discomfort, that's your business. I voted for it in good faith because it offered services. And when you say, I would like to clarify that the Central Iowa Housing Trust Fund could not find another home, this organization filled the gap. So it was not like it was competing with a private entity
Yeah.
because we could not find it. I have been to the IFA, who helped us with the Housing Trust Fund, the director of that department, who was extremely concerned that now we would not be, if the contract ended, she did not know how to help me find another home for that. So the competing with the private company, I understand your point. It may be valid in a certain situation, but it is not across the board valid. Sometimes this organization does provide services that are gap filling, that cannot be provided by a private, or will not, that maybe not can't, but is not attractive to a private corporation. And there are some difficulties having worked for 7 to 8 years to find a home. I just got to say that that's not across the board true.
Yeah, they're not gonna bid on anything that a government entity is going to bid on. And that's the bottom line, and that's where it all comes.
That was not the issue.
Okay.
That was not the
All right.
issue. We can talk about that another time. That was.
I know this is a report, but to move this conversation along, I think we recognize that Polk County and potentially Des Moines have no interest in MIPA. Is there anyone else who doesn't want to continue the relationship with MIPA? And I guess we can't vote on it because but is anyone else adamant against MIPA, or can we move along, move the next item on the agenda? We understand Polk County, Des Moines they don't want to be members. That's their own personal decision. Is anyone else part of the MPO doesn't want to be members of MIPA?
Can I just say something? Because I think there's a diversity of opinion in Des Moines about MIPA and about how we handle this transition. You know, I was here when we voted on MIPA, and I want to give them a fair shot to do the work that that this body approved. And I also think that, you know, we owe it to that entity to be mindful of, we're having discussions like this, not to be too chaotic about how we transition, and to be fair to everyone involved in that process. And that's the perspective that I come at this with. I think, you know, I think folks should know that there are folks in Des Moines that see value in MIPA. I don't know that we've figured out as a city where we are on the whole, but there are differing viewpoints, and there are folks who want to be mindful of how we have these conversations, and how we make any transition.
Thank you for that. Chuck, did you have a comment before that?
Well, yeah, it's kind of shifted so many times there. But I mean, hopefully, if we move forward with this transition plan, then for communities like yours, Ruth, you'll have a place to go for things like that, right? So that's kind of the intent here, at least in my opinion, is let's make sure they stand up. They're able to do business. We do it in a responsible manner, you know, but we still accomplish what other folks want to do, right? I want to do that too. I believe in that. I think MIPA should be its own entity. We just got to make sure we do it right. So what I would ask, because I agree, Mark, we need to move on, but you know, we've got this very, very high level, Todd, of what you're talking about. So like, I mean, is there a way we can get a more detailed plan in place with some milestones and some real dates that we can track to, that we can commit to, so that everyone knows that this is concrete and it's not just some kind of nebulous, we're going to try to get to it in a year kind of thing.
Yep, no,
So
that's,
there's a question about being facilitated, or are we gonna do it in-house? I think we need to answer that question first, how we're gonna handle the transition. I'm not objecting to the transition, by the way. I'm just saying we need time, Courtney's point, we need time, and we need a plan, to your point.
Toss?
yeah, we started those, like, with the executive board, we've started those conversations. We've had a good conversation this week with them. I think we can bring back a rough timeline next month and then have a detailed timeline in 2 months on the whole transition, if that's agreeable.
So there's no ambiguity. We want them to stand up on their own. We're willing to work with them for a little bit longer, but it's clear from MIPA and from the MPO is that we want them to stand on their own and need to come up with a plan, whether it be a year or 18 months or 6 months. There's a plan. Everyone knows they're going to stand alone or they're not going to stand at all.
So I'm just curious, procedural question. Are we going to make that decision as a policy committee to go that direction first? Or has that decision already been made?
We voted on the contract in April 2022, so I would argue the decision's already been made. Right.
To
And
continue.
we
with
have
the
a
contract?
3-year relationship with them right now. and If we can end it in 2, that's, I think, what we're asking Todd to do if it's feasible.
Yeah, I think that's feasible.
And it's up to each individual community whether they want to stay, and if they don't stay, then we don't have to participate in any of these discussions about the problem.
There any other comments, questions, concerns?
I guess the only comment I would make is we've made this very complicated for staff to be able to figure out a budget for next year. And the sooner we can come to some conclusion, the better off we're going to be. I'm anticipating, quite frankly, a large budget amendment mid-year as this all settles out. So the sooner we get that done, the better. Because our accountant is trying to keep books for different organizations at this moment, and how that happens is important.
So what I heard was, Todd, we're gonna get a very specific timeline and action steps. So that we know there are points, milestones, and we can track that. But in the meantime, that we are going to move forward with moving supervisory to MIPA as of July 1st, 23.
Right.
Okay, do you need anything else?
I think that'll do. If not, we'll be asking questions.
Okay, okay. So, thank you all. Next item, 16, report, charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary grant program, Allison. Yes.
Okay, so we talked about this a couple different times, but there's a NOFO out there, released part 2023, with a bunch of the corridor and community electric or alternative fuel charging programs. You can see here some of the things they want to be met: safety, climate change, workforce development, CFI program vision, which really looks at kind of. Okay, so there are 2 grants available. Really, we're focusing on that top one there, the community charging and fueling grant, just because that is more applicable. There is an alternative fuel corridor grant. You can't see it very well, but the alternative fuel corridors in Iowa really are 80 and 35, and then the interstate's off, not in our region. And right now, those aren't covered under the NEVI program, so we're focusing up top on community charging. Reminder, this is an 80-20 split on funding, and we'll be going forward by May 30th. So just over a month from now. Okay, so at our executive committee meeting, the city asked that instead of Polk County take the lead on this, MPO instead trade that to our agency. And so I have been meeting with Polk County staff this week, coming up to speed on who all is interested, what cities are ready to do, where their placements are. Next week, I have about 5 communities coming in to kind of do an intro and talk it through. And then it's likely that after that, based on the multiple questions that are likely to come out of this conversation, we'll pull Mid-American and that Clean Cities Coalition into another meeting to kind of really flesh those things out. And then we'll be moving forward in May with the application itself. So I will say that I've reached out to most of your communities. I have Carlisle, Mitchellville, Norwalk, and Polk City left. And so those will be given for me tomorrow morning to set those. One thing I would note for this, and there's no action to do today on this, but I did want to note when I was exchanging files with Polk County, they had approached Indianola prior to through this effort to be a part of the grant application. And I know that we've had conversations as to where that boundary is. And so before I move forward with any Indianola staff, I wanted to at least bring that here, because I think the discussion there was potentially capping, each side of the metro with some charging stations. So Ankeny, Indianola would be on that south side, and then potentially others. But if Indianola is not a go, then we'll kind of back that up. So I just would like feedback on that, if anybody has any for me at this time.
Also, I don't have feedback, but appreciate your work on it. Number one, I think it really fits well into our vein with the NPO. With clearly a transportation project that looking in the future, environmental concerns, whatever to address. I want to try to address your question if I can, but first of all, I've asked John Norris and our staff about this multiple times. It's come up in discussions over the last few years, knowing that we're going to be spending some significant resources and infrastructure for electric vehicles. And knowing that our workforce, and maybe you can't answer this because I don't know, I haven't got anyone to answer yet, but as an example, I think talking to building trades and journeyman electrician, you're talking about high voltage. They got 200 workers in Iowa and Central Iowa right now from Alabama because they have no one on the bench and no one there to do this work right now because construction is really going crazy right now. So is that, does Mid-Am or anyone like that have any opinion on whether or not we're gonna find labor force to, I mean, it's a lot of infrastructure improvements, a lot, and I think it's great. I'm just totally supportive of it, but I'm just wondering, how are we gonna get it done?
They have not brought that up. There are certain regulations in the bill itself and the grant program itself that does ask for the continuing education credits. That probably even slims down to IDW workforce or something that could work on this. I can start looking around. I don't have the answer for you today, but.
Okay, that's fine. I was just curious.
Yeah.
And the other question, I think, as far as, and I can't speak for anyone else. We've been part of this debate for some time now on working outside of our planning boundary with other jurisdictions. I don't think it really struck a nerve with me, and I can't speak for anyone else. Until we were doing non-transportation related work outside of our planning boundary with other member governments. I think we've always worked well coordinated with CERPA and the work that they've done from a regional standpoint. Transportation infrastructure impacts our region. That I'm only one vote, but I would say that probably makes some sense because it would impact us long term from a transportation standpoint. That's only my take on it.
Yeah, so I sort of add on to Tom's question. That I think it's the EVITP certification. Is like there's a training to make sure that the workforce that is installing the EV charging is trained and doing a high quality job so that you don't run into a situation, hopefully, where you install these chargers and someone pulls up and they're not working because they were installed improperly. Are we looking into that certification? And can that be a part of this grant? Because I think that certification is probably an important thing from a quality assurance perspective.
So I'll say that I haven't seen that in this grant specifically. However, I will tell you that the EPA climate pollution reduction grant, the other one that just went to Polk County, that does have a lot of workforce pieces in building, lower emissions workforce, whether it's EVs, what have you. So I don't think that it's attached to this necessarily. It mostly asks that the workers have those CEUs, probably keep it. But in this one, I haven't seen anything about workforce development. This is mostly about deployment of infrastructure.
Right, but I guess my question is, if you're gonna have to hire someone to put in that infrastructure, can we have that certification requirement as a piece of this?
So I'll look into EVIT specifically and kind of run it through. I don't remember what exactly CEUs they were asking for, see if those are similar, and we work that in here. I don't see a problem, and if that's the standard that everybody wants to go.
And I think you do a great job. I don't need to say that, and to add on to what Josh mentioned. So we talked about, we're talking about inside environment and things like that, and that workforce being available, but I didn't expand. I think that infrastructure as far as distribution goes, some of us might not realize that the amperage in any specific building would need to be increased significantly, i.e. if you got three-phase primary voltage coming into the three-phase bank that feeds your building, you're going to need to make sure that you have appropriate amperage to increase it by 240 volt power by 15, 16 cars or vehicles, however it may be. And your amperage or your meter socket or a lot of those things may not even be able to accommodate that. So I guess that just my head's just going, how that all works. I'm extremely pleased we're having this discussion, but then I'm also thinking about from an infrastructure standpoint, how does all that work? So.
Okay, we have one question on chat, Carly had your hand up.
Yeah, so, Gunnar, this will be a challenge to tee this up to the media that this important EV charging is not in the metro area, so. I mean, it's outside of the core of Des Moines.
Oh, no, that's just one site. So far, almost every single one of the MPO communities has said, yes, we want to identify XYZ site. And we're settling those this week. It's just that I think there are 4 communities that I haven't met with. And Indianola was one that was Polk County was leading with. They invited them in and they're not in the MPO community. So Des Moines, West Des Moines, Clive,
Well, I
Waukee.
thought there was a discussion once about this, that these primary stations were outside of that.
So that's for so that's a different program. So that's for NEVI. So that's the national, and that's what, oh, it's gone, but that's what that map was showing. So NEVI is focused on the interstates, kind of bring down charging anxiety on long distance trips. And this is more for, a lot of the cities are looking at libraries, parks, things like that. So it's community,
Okay.
and it's not fast charging, it'd be level 2, instead of the fast charging. So yeah, there are 2 different, there's a lot of these.
Okay.
It is like a cash queue here. Yeah, so,
David Jones on Zoom. What, you have a question? You have your hand up?
I do. Just a quick question. So I'm assuming that if this moves forward, the MPO would be responsible moving forward for the administration of the grant, including all of the ongoing compliance and reporting to the federal government. I just want to make sure that that was the plan with Polk County. I want to make sure that was the plan with the MPO.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Question related to like the fund this movement. So we invite somebody to send on the outside of the MPO and we get X amount of money from the federal government. How are we going to divvy that up? Is it going to go to priority MPO membership and is Indianola going to get cut out of it?
So I think that's something, so I got a similar question and I asked, the Clean Cities Coalition, and she thinks that that's gonna have to be an internal decision, that we might hear from the Department of Energy that they have priorities and see some of the projects that they would. But that would be a decision if we don't get fully funded for all of it, that we would have to make. And so that is a consideration, you know, whether it's by location or population or distance or in the NPO. It's not an answer I have for you. I think it's an answer that you all honestly will have to make. Eventually.
So it would be easier to exclude Indianola right from the start. And then we don't have to worry about.
They are an
So I will-
associate member.
Yeah, so they are an associate member, so they're not here. I will say that one of the big streamlined pieces that is connected through a lot of these grants is the regional coordination and reaching out to your neighbors. And so, you know, I won't say that, you know, by reaching out to Indianola or another entity outside the NPO region, we will bolster our application by X amount, but that is something that they are heavily looking at and want to have that cohesive connections. And so, you know, it could bolster a little bit.
All right,
Yeah.
so we'll just give priority, we'll give priority.
I've also had it, so I'm just kind of digesting.
Okay, Lynn.
My only comment is, I'm okay with Indianola coming in more from the standpoint of this transient workforce that we have. So people that are coming out of Des Moines, they're going down there to work, and then those folks trying to get back to Des Moines. And if we want people to have electric or EV vehicles in our communities, we've got to be able to provide that connection that they can get back and forth to work or whatever those activities may be in other communities.
Well, and I think that's why, Indianola was the first one that Polk County had heard back from, that they did have interest, but there was on the table, that we could cap it a little bit outside. So, maybe it's up to Alleman or even Story County or something. And so that's why I'm at least gonna bring the Indianola, see where we get there before we say, all in or all out, because yeah, we really could send it out to SERPTA and say, hey, if we're gonna do this, let's do this. I would ask for more of my staff's beautiful time and assistance, but that's something that we kind of need.
But how far will we reach? That
Yeah,
depends on where you cap that at.
And I think, yeah, that's not necessarily a decision I can make, it is.
Hey, just Allison, just for context, what's the level 2? How much is one charging station for level 2? I know the top ones are way.
I got asked how much and I tried to find it. I'm guessing about $68,000 just for the thing itself, but please don't quote me. I will have better information.
Now that's supposed to
Let me do, I've had this for 3 days. And I will say, it's not as expensive as the fast chargers, right? This is for destination charging. So when you see a lot of places, the cities are putting in, they're expecting people to be there 1, 2, 3 hours. And so it is a slower charge. And so it's going to be not nearly as expensive as our big supercharging station.
Yeah, I mean, I think for reference, we've been installing for maybe 30,000 for, you get 2 for level 2.
For level 2?
Yeah.
Is that in your RAMs?
That's what's in our RAMs.
Close proximity.
That cost.
Yeah, and that's with all the pieces, too, right? The installation,
That's
the
what-
whole kit and caboodle.
That's the whole,
Okay.
I think, whole thing. Not much.
Thank you, Allison. If anybody else has any other questions for Allison or comments, we can contact her.
Yeah, I'll just note that I am kind of having like an open office hours this Monday with many of your communities to kind of walk through this, where the sites kind of figure out what questions we do need to have answered. And the communities that I haven't talked to, they'll get an invitation. after it's done. Okay, let me know if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 17, report policies and procedures manual and employee handbook update. Todd.
Yes, thank you. We presented the documents last month. The handbook review committee has been formed, and I believe David Jones, who the MPO chair asked to lead that effort, recently sent out an email for the review committee on that. The policy and procedures manual is still under review. Once that's done, we'll also ask the finance subcommittee to tweak some of the financial related policies in there. And then we'll get feedback from the committees on that in the coming months. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Todd? Thank you, Todd. 18, report Purple Heart Highway update. Gunner.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll keep this brief. There's not a whole lot to update you on, but there has been some stuff part of this. As you all know, we are still in phase 2, where we're pursuing state fire redemptions. I do want to emphasize this is a long process. We're still building a lot of relationships. As you all have heard me say before, we did have meetings with egg stakeholders in November and December, and we recently learned that they reconvened once to discuss a possible path forward. The feedback we've gotten from that so far has been very positive. They're saying that the people that are feeling much more positive about the interactions this time around, less hesitancy or oppositional. We don't think ag is in a position where we want to push this. It's not really, they don't see it as their issue to push. But there is potential for them to not to give a yellow light, so to speak, and not be a no. That being said, we are still in a waiting position. They committed to us that they would reconvene a second time and then provide that feedback to us in a more formal manner so we have something to point to. So we're still waiting on that feedback from them. At that time, we'll assess our situation, and I anticipate that additional ag stakeholder outreach will be important. Councilman Gatto has brought up numerous times that we need to have ongoing engagement with the Farm Bureau. Could not agree more. That will happen. We'll continue to be in the waiting pattern to get official feedback out of that most recent round of ag stakeholder. I do want to note that we have had some early discussion with lawmakers at the State House. These happened at their invitation. There is interest into it, and what we're hearing is there's definitely commitment to doing this the right way, and that there's interest in walking, not running. There's no point in rushing this.
And that support would be conditional on Yellow Lake from stakeholders, as all policymakers in this room have agreed. It's going to be continued, as we all know, it's going to be important to continue engaging with our many stakeholders. At this point, it's now looking like any action is likely this year. I think that's it for my pieces right here, but I'll mention that Mayor Anwig was at the first meeting with lawmakers. Supervisor Snell from Warren County was in the meeting with the second round of lawmakers, and I would just invite Supervisor Snell to say anything if he wanted to. I believe he's online. I did not tell him I was going to educate. At any rate, at that point, I open up to any questions you might have.
Questions for Gunnar? Okay, thank you for the update. 19 water trails update, Todd.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to give you a quick update on progress to date on the trail. The past 2 weeks, they've moved about 10,000 tons of riprap hauled from Plano, Iowa. Also 1,200 tons of boulders hauled in from Redwood, Minnesota. The construction office is set up and operational. It's on the east side of the river. They've completed all the clearing and grubbing. The Icon has installed a construction camera. I'll show you a picture from that here in a second. They'll continue to haul rock to the storage sites. They're using the city of Des Moines snow storage sites for that, or some of their snow storage sites for that. Appreciate that support. They're finishing their dewatering plan around the dam with DNR, so they can get to do the modifications on that and then get in river. They're also waiting for the river to come down. The Corps has been doing a sedimentation survey on Saylorville Lake. So they've been releasing more water than they typically do in the spring. That's supposed to end this month. And so then they'll start holding back water again, and the river should drop, and they'll get those things worked on. Next slide, please. This is the camera location from that Eagle View Lofts building, looking back to the northwest up to the Scott Street Dam and Bridge there. You can see the clearing that's been done on both sides of the river. The city has a levee project going on this near bank currently. Next slide, please. Just a couple pictures of rocks. The one on the left is the riprap rock that's being stored, and then the large boulders on the left. So you'll be seeing more of those being hauled in. Don't know if there's another slide or not. Yeah, wanted to touch base. Bob mentioned we pulled those three items earlier in the agenda. One of them related to the line of credit. Icon opened the line of credit with Bankers Trust for $15 million to manage the cash flow, requesting MPO to be on that agreement since we hold the construction contract. Liability for that, signing onto that line of credit is covered under our sub agreement number 2 that was approved previously. Next slide. Destination Iowa grant. Great Outdoors Foundation received a $7 million Destination Iowa grant from IEDA for the Water Trails project. IDEA is requiring the MPO to be a signatory on that since we hold the construction contract. This would be a partnership agreement that's been drafted between IDEA, the Outdoors Foundation, and the MPO. Again, we developed an indemnification agreement to remove liability from the MPO. Scott can address that more if there's particular questions. We'll be bringing these back next month for approval. I think that's the last one. Oh, and just the indemnification agreement itself. As I mentioned, MPO legal counsel has worked with the council for the Outdoor Foundation and Icon to draft this to remove liability from the MPO related to the Destination Iowa grant. Happy to answer questions.
Any questions for Todd? Okay. Thank you. Number 20, report legislative update. Dylan.
Thank you. I'll be brief on this. The Congress is working through the FY24 appropriations process. Last month, or I guess in February now, the president sent their budget to Congress, I guess in March. So now they're working through that. The final bill will be later this summer or fall. So this will time out nicely when we're in DC next month to talk to our legislators about what we want to see in that bill. I would note that we're hearing that some of the transportation components of that will be less than what was authorized in the infrastructure bill a few years ago. There were some projects, there's some funding programs that had advanced appropriations, so they're going to be okay. But those that did not have advanced appropriations, and then this includes build, part of the build funding did not have advanced appropriations, might be lower. And this has to do with the fact that the transportation funding is tied to housing funding in Congress. It's through the Transportation Housing and Urban Development Bill. Housing funds are less than what they anticipated because of some of the banking stuff going on and interest rates and so forth. So that could impact some of the transportation money just because there's nowhere else to pull the money. And they need to have they can't pull from housing sold. So that's kind of what we're hearing. So again, we'll learn more as this process goes along. We'll keep you updated, talking to DC with them directly and see what we can find out.
Thank you. Upcoming events, Allison.
So there's a whole list in your packet, just a couple that have come up lately. One is actually utilizing partners for celebrating the adoption of EVs. Virtual on the 15th, there will be a transportation research board meeting in Cedar Rapids that could be themed this summer as well. And then the TRB transportation resilience is next winter. We won't talk about that yet. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. Other non-action items of interest to the committee. Are there any?
And I'd like to thank you guys for coming over last week and thanks to everyone, did a good job.
Anything else? Yeah.
Want to give you a heads up. In August of last year, Policy Committee authorized staff to begin working with Now to develop a new website. As part of the development website, we are updating our digital assets. And our goal here is to be scalable so that we have a different size of logos for different size devices. And so we have updated the logo. So this is what we're trying to achieve, which is a scalability of the size where you have a full size logo, small size logo, and they all are recognizable. And so this is what we come up with. Implementation is going to be incremental. We'll start seeing this on a handful of things here in the coming months. But once the website is up, then it'll be updated on the digital assets. Just want to give you a heads up that that's coming. Happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you. Next meeting date, May 18th, 2023 at 4 p.m. There's nothing else. Meeting is adjourned.